Chapter 3, Part 2. The tavern called Yorand was on a slightly removed alleyway, but it looked well kept enough. Local craftsmen appeared to make up the bulk of its clientele. Lawrence found himself suddenly tired when they arrived at the Yorand Tavern. Holo, on the other hand, was quite energetic, probably because she'd managed to outwit two merchants at once. The hour was yet early, so the tavern was mostly empty, and their wine was out very quickly. Holo drained hers in one huge draught, while Lawrence was content to nurse his. "Ah, wine," said Holo, belching a fine belch. She lifted her wood cup and ordered another round, which the tavern girl acknowledged with a smile. "What troubles you? Aren't you going to drink?" said Holo, munching away on some fried beans. She didn't seem to be particularly dizzy with success, though, so Lawrence decided to broach the subject directly. "Have you ever worked as a merchant?" Holo, still munching the snack and holding her refilled glass, smiled ruefully. "Oh, I'm sorry. Have I injured your pride?" Naturally, she had. "I don't know how many deals you have done in your life, but I watched countless transactions when I was in the village. Long ago, I once saw a man use that technique. I didn't invent it myself. When was that, anyway?" Lawrence didn't speak, but his eyes held the question. "Is that true?" Holo looked slightly troubled as she nodded, and Lawrence sighed even as he felt somewhat relieved. "I really hadn't noticed, though. Last night when I slept in the furs, I didn't smell any fruit." "Oh, that was from the apples we bought." Lawrence was speechless. When had she pulled that trick? And suddenly he felt a chill of worry. It was fraud. "It's his own fault for being tricked," said Holo. "He'll be impressed once he figures it out." "You may have a point." "There's no point in being angry when you've been tricked. A real merchant knows to be impressed." "That's quite a sermon. You sound like a wizened old trader." "And you're just a babe in arms yourself." Lawrence had to laugh. He shrugged as he drank his wine. It had a keen taste to it. "All this aside, did you do as you were supposed to?" Holo was talking about the Zarin matter. "I asked around the Malone Company to see if anybody knew about nations that would be issuing new silver currency, but they didn't seem to be hiding anything. As long as the information isn't something that needs to be monopolized, they'll normally share it. Makes for good business relations." "But chances for this kind of deal aren't common. That's why we're involved." It wasn't vanity. It was reality. In currency speculation, prices either rose, fell, or held steady. Even if the details became complex, all one had to do was turn it over in one's head until one hit upon the solution. Once the proposed deal was reduced to the party that would gain and the one that would lose, there were few decisions to make. Still, whatever the trick, as long as we can avoid getting fleeced and come out ahead, we'll be fine. Lawrence drank some wine and popped some beans into his mouth. Holo was paying, so he decided he might as well take advantage of it. "I don't see the owner anywhere. I wonder if he's out," he said. "Zarin did say we could contact him through the bar. He must be on good terms with the establishment." "Well, traveling merchants usually base their operations out of either a tavern or a trading house. In fact, I've got to get to a trading house later on. And the owner really isn't around, is he?" said Lawrence, scanning the tavern yet again. It was a fairly spacious establishment, with 15 round tables, only 2 other people. Craftsmen, from the look of them, were in the tavern. He couldn't very well just go talk to them, so he asked the girl when she brought them another round of wine, along with some roasted herring and smoked mutton. "The owner?" said the girl, as she set the wine and food on the table. Her arms were very slender. Lawrence wondered where she got the strength to handle the heavy food. "He's gone to buy ingredients at the marketplace," she continued. "Do you have some business with him?" "Could you possibly tell him we're trying to get in touch with a man named Zarin?" If they didn't know Zarin here, that was fine too. Many merchants use taverns as convenient points of contact, so a misunderstanding was entirely possible. But it turned out to be unnecessary concern on Lawrence's part. The girl's eyes brightened immediately at the mention of Zarin. "Oh, Mr. Zarin? I know of him." "Do you?" "He normally comes soon after sundown. Feel free to stay here until then." She was a shrewd girl indeed, but she had a point. It was an hour or two until dusk, which would be just enough time to enjoy a nice leisurely drink. "We'll take you up on that, then," said Lawrence. "Do enjoy yourselves," said the girl with a bow, then turned to attend to the tavern's other 2 patrons. Lawrence drank from his cup of wine. Its tart scent wafted across his nose, fading to sweetness on his tongue. Some liquors, like rum, traded on their intensity, but Lawrence preferred the sweetness of wine or mead. Sometimes he'd have cider just for a change. Beer was good too, but its flavor depended on the skill of the craftsman and the taste of the person drinking it. Unlike wine, whose quality depended entirely on price, a beer's deliciousness was unrelated to its cost, so merchants tended to avoid it. There was no way to know if the particular brew would suit your taste unless you were from the region or town. So when he wanted to appear local, Lawrence would order beer. Lawrence thought on this when he noticed that Holo, sitting opposite him, had stopped eating. She appeared to be deep in thought. Lawrence spoke up to get her attention, but she was slow in answering. "That girl, she's lying," she finally said, once the girl had disappeared into the kitchen. "Lying how?" "Zarin doesn't necessarily come in here every day." Lawrence nodded, looking into his wine cup. "Well, I hope we'll see Zarin soon, as she says." The girl's lie meant that she was already in touch with Zarin. If not, things would be complicated now for both Lawrence and the mysterious young merchant. "As do I," said Holo. The reason for the lie was unclear, though. It could be that she was able to call Zarin any time she wanted, and simply wanted to keep Lawrence and Holo at the table and ordering wine for a little while longer. Merchants and traders told lies large and small all the time. Worrying over every single one would soon drive one to distraction. So Lawrence wasn't particularly worried, and he imagined Holo was the same. And other than Holo's delight at the honeycomb-shaped honeyed stew, the sun set without incident, and soon customers began filtering into the tavern. Among them was Zarin. "I rejoice at our reunion," said Zarin, raising his wine cup. It knocked against Lawrence's with a pleasant clock. "How fared your furs? They fetched a good price, as you can tell from the wine." "I envy you. I dare say you had an angle." Lawrence didn't reply immediately, instead taking a drink of wine. "That's a secret." Holo was busily devouring the beans, possibly to hide her smirk. "Well, in any case, I'm glad you were able to sell them for a good price. For my part, more capital means more profit." "Just because I have more capital doesn't mean I'll be increasing my investment. Say it's not so. I prayed for your good fortune in anticipation of just that." "Then you've been praying at the wrong place. You should have just prayed for me to up my investment." Zarin gazed upward, his face a mask of exaggerated tragedy. "So, to business then," said Lawrence. "Ah, right." Zarin composed himself and looked at Lawrence, but looked briefly to Holo as well, as though he knew she, too, was a figure not to be underestimated. "In exchange for selling me the information of which silver currency is due to become purer, you want a portion of the profit I'll make. Does that sum it up?" "Indeed." "Is the story of a purer coin true?" Zarin faltered slightly on the directness of the question. "Well, I'm predicting it based on information I got from a small mining town. I think it's trustworthy, but there are no guarantees in business." "True enough." Lawrence nodded, satisfied at seeing Zarin cringe. He brought some stew to his lips and continued. "If you told me it was a sure thing, I'd have had to walk away. Nothing is more suspicious than a guarantee." Zarin sighed in relief. "So, what would you want for a percentage?" 10 trenny for the information, plus 10% of your profit." "That's a very conservative demand given the potential gain." "It is. If you should take a loss, I won't be able to compensate you. If I had to, all my assets would be forfeit. So I'll take 10% of whatever you make, but if you take a loss, I'll refund you the information fee, and no more." Lawrence mulled the issue over, his mind long since fuzzy from liquor. Zarin's proposal boiled down to roughly 2 possibilities. The first was that he, Lawrence, would sustain a loss, and Zarin would use that for his own gain. The second was that Zarin's proposal was basically sound. However, thanks to Holo, he knew that Zarin's claim that the currency in question would rise in value owing to an increased silver content was a lie. If so, Zarin planned to profit from Lawrence's loss, but Lawrence didn't yet know how. Given this, Lawrence began to wonder if Holo's estimation of Zarin was mistaken after all. It didn't make sense that Zarin's goal was the paltry information fee. But it wouldn't matter how much time he spent thinking about it. Only when he got the information from Zarin would he be able to get a fresh perspective. If it became obvious that he would sustain a loss, he could just get his information fee back. With a little bit of speculation he could dodge any problems, and now his interest in whatever Zarin was planning was greater than ever. "That sounds good enough to me." Oh, thank you very much. Just to confirm, you want 10 Shrenny to provide me with the information and 10% of my earnings. However, if I lose money, you'll return the fee to me, and you won't be liable for further losses. Yes. And we'll sign a contract to this effect before a public witness. Yes. As for the settlement day, can we make it 3 days before the spring market? I expect the currency to change within the year. The spring market was still half a year out. It was enough time for the currency to settle into its new value, be it up or down. If it actually rose, there would be an accompanying increase of confidence in the currency, and people would be happy to do business using it. Its market value would rise rapidly. Those who sold it impatiently would lose out. That will do. It should be sufficient time. In that case, I look forward to seeing you at the public witness's office early tomorrow morning. There was no reason to refuse. Lawrence nodded and raised his cup. To profit for both of us. At the sight of both men raising their cups, the listless Holo scrambled to get her cup in her hand. To profit! There was a pleasant clock as the cups knocked against each other. The public witness, just as the name implies, is a public service for providing witnesses for contracts. However, just because the contract was signed before a public witness, the town guard would not necessarily catch someone who breached it. Even the monarchy, in charge of the public good as it was, would not do that. Instead, the offending party's identity would be spread around by the public witness. This was fatal to a merchant. For larger deals, this was even truer. A merchant with a bad reputation wouldn't even be able to deal with traders from foreign countries, at least not in that particular city. The consequences weren't particularly effective for people who were going to retire from trading, but as long as they planned to continue as a merchant, the incentive was enough. It was before such a public witness that Lawrence signed the contract, paid Zarin the 10 Trenny, and received the information without incident. Lawrence and Holo then parted ways with Zarin and headed into the town marketplace. The empty wagon would only cause problems in the crowded town center, so they left it at the inn and went in on foot. This is the silver the boy mentioned, yes? Holo held a silver Trenny. It was the most widely used currency in the region because among the hundreds of different kinds of currency in the world, it was one of the most trusted, and also simply because this town and the region around it were within the nation of Trenny. Nations that did not have their own currency were doomed to either collapse or become client nations of larger powers. It's a well-trusted coin in this region, said Lawrence. Trusted? Holo looked up at Lawrence as she played with the coin on which the profile of the 11th ruler of Trenny was engraved. There are hundreds of currencies in the world, and the amount of gold or silver in each varies constantly. Trust is an important part of currency. Huh. I only knew of a few different kinds of money. It used to be that business was done in animal skins. Lawrence wondered exactly how many hundreds of years ago she was talking about. So, how about it? Have you worked something out now that you know which coin he was talking about? Well, there are several possibilities. For example, asked Holo, as they walked past the stalls in the marketplace. She stopped suddenly, and a big man who had the look of a worker about him bumped into her. He was just about to shout at her when Holo looked up from underneath her cloak and apologized. The man reddened and managed to say, Well, be more careful. Lawrence silently resolved not to be swayed by this particular tactic of Holo's. What's wrong? He asked. I want to eat one of those. Holo was pointing at a bread stall. It was just before midday, so fresh baked bread was lined up in neat rows. In front of a stall, a maid was buying more bread than she could possibly eat, probably for the midday meal of some craftsman and his apprentice. You want some bread? That one there, with the honey on it. Holo indicated some long, thin loaves that were being showily displayed from the eaves of the stall. The honey-drizzled bread was popular in most places. Lawrence seemed to remember that the tradition was started in a certain city where a baker had hung the loaves from the eaves of his shop as he drizzled them with honey as a way to attract customers. The tactic had been so successful that fights broke out among the people who wanted to buy the bread, and the bakers' union had made it official policy that all honey bread would be henceforth hung from the eaves. The bread did look delicious, but Lawrence couldn't help grinning at Holo's sweet tooth showing itself yet again. You have money, he told her. Go ahead and buy some if you want. I don't imagine bread and apples are far apart in price. Will you carry the mountain of bread I'll bring back with me? Or shall I ruin the baker's day by asking him for so much change? Lawrence finally understood. All Holo had were silver Trenny coins, each of which was worth far more than it took to buy a loaf of bread. She'd bought more apples than she was able to carry with a similar coin. All right, I'll give you a smaller coin. Here, hold out your hands. One of these black coins should get you 1 loaf. Lawrence took the silver coin from Holo's hands and replaced it with several brown and black copper coins, pointing at the coin he wanted her to use. Holo scrutinized the currency carefully. "You'd best not be cheating me," she said suspiciously. He thought about kicking her, but Holo soon turned on her heel and headed for the baker's stall. "Always with the quick tongue," retorted Lawrence, but in truth he couldn't claim he wasn't enjoying himself. When he saw Holo walking back, her face the very picture of contentment as she sank her teeth into the bread, he couldn't help laughing. "Don't bump into anyone else," Lawrence said. "I don't want to have to deal with a fight." "Don't treat me like a pup, then. It's hard to see you as anything else when your mouth is covered in sticky honey." For a moment Lawrence thought she was sulking in anger, but the aged wolf was not so easily provoked. "Am I charming, then?" She looked up at Lawrence with her head cocked slightly, whereupon he slapped her on the head. "You certainly can't take a joke," she grumbled. "I'm a very serious person," said Lawrence. Her faintly flustered demeanor went unnoticed. "So, what was it you were thinking about?" "Oh, right. It was better to bring up the previous topic of conversation than stay in this uncomfortable territory. "So, back to the Trenny coin. Zarin may well be telling the truth." "Oh?" "There are reasons to raise the silver content, so... Here, take this coin. A silver Firin. It's from a nation 3 rivers south of here. It's got a respectable silver content, and it's quite popular in the marketplace. You could say it's the Trenny's rival." "Huh. Seems one thing never changes. A nation's power is in its money." The always quick Holo munched away on her bread. "Exactly. Nations do not always fight through strength of arms. If your country's currency is overwhelmed by a foreign coin, you've been just as thoroughly conquered. All the foreign king needs to do is cut off your supply of money, and your marketplace will die. Without money, you can neither buy nor sell. They control your economy." "So they're increasing the silver content in order to gain advantage over their rival," said Holo, licking her fingers after finishing the bread. Having come that far, Lawrence imagined that Holo might realize she had something to say. "I suppose my ears aren't completely omniscient." "Evidently," she said. "It's entirely possible that Zarin wasn't actually lying," agreed Lawrence. I quite agree." She was being so reasonable that Lawrence found himself taken aback. Even though she'd admitted she wasn't perfectly accurate, he fully expected her to angrily chide him for doubting her senses. "What, did you think I was going to be angry?" "I surely did." "Well, I might be angry at that," she said with a mischievous smile. In any case, Zarin might not have been lying. So where are we going now?" "Now that we know which coin to look into, we're going to look into it." "So, to the mint?" Lawrence couldn't help laughing at her naive question, which earned him a sharp, angry look. "If a merchant like me showed up at the mint, the only greeting I'd give would be the business end of a spear. No, we're going to see the canvas." "Huh. I guess there are things even I don't know." Lawrence was understanding Holo's personality better and better. "Once we're there, we'll see how the coin has been performing recently." "What do you mean?" "When a currency's value changes drastically, there are always signs. Like the weather before a storm." Lawrence smiled at the amusing analogy. "Something like that. When the purity is going to increase a lot, it increases a little at a time. And when it's going to drop, it will drop gradually." It didn't seem like Holo fully understood, so Lawrence launched into a lecture, sounding for all the world like a determined schoolteacher. "Currency is based on trust. Relative to the absolute value of the gold or silver in them, coins are obviously more highly valued. Of course, the value is set very carefully, but since what you're actually doing is arbitrarily assigning a value to something with so no inherent worth, you can think of it as a ball of trust. In fact, as long as the changes to a coin's purity aren't large, they're impossible to detect. Even a cambist has difficulty with it. You have to melt the coin down to be sure, but because a currency is based on trust, when it gains popularity, its actual value can exceed its face value, or do the opposite. There are many possible reasons for changes in its popularity, and one of the biggest is a change in the silver or gold purity of the coin. That's why people are so sensitive to changes in a currency. So sensitive that even changes too small to detect with eyeglasses or a scale can still be considered major." He finished his lengthy digression. Holo stared off into the distance, appearing to be deep in thought. Lawrence suspected even the canny Holo wouldn't understand everything from the first explanation. He prepared himself to answer her questions, but none were forthcoming. When he looked more carefully at her face, she seemed not to be trying to piece things together in her head, but rather as if she was confirming something. He didn't want to believe it, but she may well have understood perfectly the first time. So when whoever makes the coins wants to change the purity, first they'll make a minute change to see what the reaction is, then they'll adjust it up or down, yes? Having an apprentice like this was certainly a mixed blessing. A superior apprentice was the pride of any merchant, but humiliation lurked. Lawrence hid the frustration he felt. It had taken him a full month to understand the concept of currency valuation. "Yeah, that's about right," he answered. "The human world certainly is complicated," despite the admission her comprehension was terrifyingly quick. As the two conversed, they approached a narrow river. It wasn't the slough that flowed by Pazio, but rather an artificial canal that diverted water from the slough, so that goods coming down the river could be efficiently transported into the city center without having to bring them ashore first. To that end, rafts were constantly floating along the river, tended by boatmen whose voices as they shouted at one another were now audible. Lawrence was headed for the bridge that spanned the canal. Cambists and goldsmiths had long situated their businesses on bridges. There they would set up their tables and their scales and do business. Naturally, they were closed on rainy days. "Oh, it's quite crowded," remarked Holo as they reached the largest bridge in Pazio. With the sluice gates closed, flooding was impossible, so a bridge far larger than ever could be constructed over an ordinary river, connected both sides of the canal, with cambists and goldsmiths packed elbow to elbow along its sides. All were highly successful, and the cambists in particular were kept busy changing money from lands near and far. Next to them, the goldsmiths busied themselves with their jewelry and alchemy. There were no crucibles for melting metal, but small jobs and orders for larger ones were common. As one would expect from a place where the bulk of the city's taxes were levied, the place fairly smelled of money. "There are so many. How does one choose? Any merchant worth his salt has a favorite cambist in each town. Follow me." They walked up the congested bridge, Holo scurrying to keep up with Lawrence. The bridges were crowded with passerby, even in the best of times, and even though it was now illegal everywhere, the apprentices of the cambists and goldsmiths would jump from the bridge on errands for their masters. Turning the Nevertheless, the liveliness inevitably resulted in fraud, and it was always the customers who risked being cheated. "Ah, there he is." Lawrence himself had been swindled many times in the past, and only once he'd made friends with certain money changers had it stopped. His favorite cambists in Pazio looked a bit younger than him. "Ho, Weiss, it's been a while," said Lawrence to the fair-haired cambist, who was just finishing business with another customer. Weiss looked up at the mention of his name and smiled broadly upon recognizing Lawrence. "Well, if it isn't Lawrence! It has indeed been a while. When did you get into town?" The association between the two professionals had been long. It was like a friendship, formed not out of kindness but necessity. "Just yesterday," replied Lawrence. "Took a detour from Yoren's to do some business." "You never change, old friend. You look well." "I'm all right. How about yourself?" "Hemorrhoids, my friend. Finally caught the curse of our trade. It's not pleasant." Weiss spoke with a smile, but it was the unpleasant proof of the true cambist. Sitting all day in one place so as not to miss a customer, nearly all of them suffered from hemorrhoids eventually. "So, what brings you here today? Coming by at this hour means you must have need of my services, eh?" "Yeah, actually. I have a favor to ask." Are you all right?" asked Lawrence. As if coming out of a dream, Weiss looked back to Lawrence from somewhere else. His eyes soon drifted away to elsewhere, though. He was looking at the figure next to Lawrence. "Who's the girl?" "Picked her up in Pazlo on my way here." "Huh. Picked her up, you say?" "Well, more or less, wouldn't you say?" "Might not be quite the word for it, but more or less I'll allow," said Holo with some reluctance, pausing her curious glancing here and there to answer Lawrence. "So, what's your name, miss?" "Mine? 'Tis Holo." "Holo, eh? Good name." Weiss grinned shamelessly. Holo returned it with a not altogether displeased smile that Lawrence did not particularly appreciate. "Well, if you've nowhere in particular to go, why not work here?" I just happen to find myself in want of a maid. Someday you might follow in my footsteps, or even become my bride. Weiss, I've come for a favor, said Lawrence, cutting him off. Weiss looked suitably offended. What, have you already had your way with her? Weiss had always had an indelicate manner of speaking. Far from having had his way with her, Lawrence found himself being toyed with by Holo, so he answered with an emphatic negative. Well, then you should let me have a go, snapped Weiss, looking to Holo and smiling sweetly. Holo fidgeted nervously, occasionally pausing to say things like, "Oh my," an affectation Lawrence failed to find amusing. Naturally, he concealed his irritation. We'll discuss that later. Business first. Fine, then. What do you want? Holo snickered. Have you any recently minted Trenny coins? If you can, I'd like the 3 most recently issued coins. What, do you know something about the purity changing? Weiss knew his business. He immediately realized what Lawrence was up to. Something like that, said Lawrence. Well, watch yourself, friend. 'Tisn't so easy to get ahead of the crowd, said Weiss, which meant that even the Cambists hadn't heard of any imminent changes. So, do you have any or don't you? I do indeed. There's a new coin came out just last month, at Advent. Then the one before that. Here it is. Weiss produced 4 coins from slots in the wooden box behind him and gave them to Lawrence. The year of issue was carved in the wood. There was no visible difference between any of the coins. We handle money all day and haven't noticed anything. They're cast in the same mold, using the same ingredients. The lineup of artisans at the mint hasn't changed in years. There have been no coups, and there's no reason to change the coins, said Weiss. The weight and color of the coins had already been scrutinized, but Lawrence still held them up to the sun and looked at them carefully. It seemed there really hadn't been any change. It's no use, friend. If you could tell just by looking, we'd have noticed long ago, said Weiss, his chin in his cupped hands. Give it up, he seemed to be saying. What now, I wonder? Said Lawrence with a sigh, returning the coins to Weiss's outstretched palm. They made a pleasant clinking sound as they fell. Don't want to melt them down, eh? Said Weiss. Don't be ridiculous. I can't do that, Lawrence retorted. Melting down currency was a crime in any country. Weiss laughed at the preposterous notion. However, Lawrence was now at a loss. He'd been sure that if there had been any change in the coin, Weiss would have had some idea of it. What to do? It was then that Holo spoke up. Let me see them, she said, at which point Weiss looked up and gave her his best smile. Oh, certainly, certainly, he said, handing the coins over. Though when she reached out to take them, he took her hands, not letting go for some time. Oh, sir, you're such a cad, said Holo with a smile, to shattering effect. Weiss reddened and scratched his head. Can you tell something? Lawrence asked, ignoring Weiss. He doubted even Holo would be able to discern the purity of a coin. Well now, let's see, she said. Just when he wondered what she would do, Holo brought the hand that contained the money to her ear and shook it, jingling the coins. Ha ha! Now that's impossible, said Weiss with a grin. It was said that master money changers with decades of experience could tell a coin's purity just by listening to its sound, but that was mostly legend. It was like saying a merchant's goods would always appreciate. But Lawrence wondered. Holo had a wolf's ears after all. Said Holo once she was finished. She chose 2 coins and returned the rest to the money-changing table. She jingled those 2 coins together, then repeated the process with different combinations of coins, a total of 6 times to check all possible combinations. Then she spoke. I cannot tell, she said. Perhaps possessed by the memory of how bashful Holo had been when he grabbed her hands, Weiss put on an expression of sympathy so exaggerated it was hard not to wonder if he'd ever return to normal. Oh, too bad indeed, he said. Well, we've wasted enough of your time, said Lawrence. We'll have a drink sometime. Indeed, that's a promise. A promise, you hear me? Overpowered by Weiss's vehemence, Lawrence promised. Then the pair put the canvas stall behind them. Nonetheless, Weiss waved enthusiastically at them as they left. Holo looked back several times and waved shyly in return. Once the crowds closed around them and Weiss could no longer be seen, Holo looked ahead again. She burst into laughter. He's an interesting sort. For a matchless philanderer, I suppose so. It wasn't a lie, but Lawrence felt he had to take Weiss down a notch anyway. So, what about the silver purity? Has it risen or fallen? He asked, smiling down at Holo. Her grin disappeared and she seemed surprised. You've gotten quite good at ferreting the truth out, haven't you? I'm the only one who knows about those ears of yours, after all. I know I saw them twitch. Holo chuckled. Can't let my guard down. But what surprised me is that you didn't say anything about it there. Your lie was unexpected. Whether or not he would have believed me aside, we don't know what the other people nearby would have done. The fewer people there's no secret, the better, no? I suppose you can consider compensation. Compensation? Lawrence parroted back. He wondered what he'd done that merited compensating. You were a bit jealous back then, no? This is in exchange for that. Lawrence's expression stiffened at Holo's teasing glance. How had she known? Or was she just a little too good at luring him into tipping his hand? Oh, don't worry about it. All men burn with foolish jealousy. It was painfully true. But women are fools to take delight in it. The world is full of fools no matter where you look, said Holo, drawing slightly nearer to Lawrence. It seemed that Holo had experience with romance as well as matters mercantile. She chuckled. Though to me, you're both just lowly humans. Yet here you are, in human form. Best not bare your fangs now in front of your beloved wolves. Ha! A flick of my lovely tail charms human and wolf alike. Holo put a hand on her hip and swayed insucculently. Somehow, Lawrence got the feeling that she wasn't lying. Joking aside, she said to Lawrence's relief, it was just a bit, but the new coins have a slightly duller sound. Duller? Holo nodded. A duller sound meant that the silver purity had dropped. A small change was hard to discern, but if the purity dropped enough for the silver coins to become visibly darker, any plebeian could tell the difference in sound. If what Holo said was true, it could be a sign that the trenny was going to become less pure. But if that's true, it's reasonable to assume that Zarin was lying all along. I wonder, the boy will have to return your 10 trenny, depending on how this plays out. I hadn't gotten that far. If he just wanted to swindle some money by selling bad information, he'd have done it at the church without going to all the trouble of meeting at a bar. 'Tis a puzzlement. Holo laughed, but in his mind Lawrence was frantically trying to figure out the situation. But the more he thought about it, the stranger it got. What was Zarin planning? He was unquestionably planning something. If Lawrence could figure out the motive, he knew he might be able to profit as well. That's why he'd taken this risk in the first place. But the fact that he still hadn't the faintest idea of Zarin's true motivation bothered him. How did anyone make money from a drop in silver price and coin purity in the first place? All they could think of was long-term investment. If gold or silver fell from a high price to a low, you could sell at the high price, then buy up exactly what you sold after it fell. You'd end up with exactly as much gold as you started with, plus the difference in price. Speculation on gold and silver was always fluctuating. If you waited for it to return to its original price, you could realize a profit in the end. However, he didn't have time for that kind of long-term planning. For one thing, half a year simply wasn't enough time. Well, Zarin brought me the deal, so he must have something to gain. He must. Assuming he's not some kind of fool, added Holo. He did mention not being responsible for losses, which means... Holo began to laugh. What? You've been taken, my friend. Lawrence turned to Holo, startled. Taken? Oh, yes. For what? The 10 trenny? Forcing money out of someone isn't the only kind of swindle. Lawrence had heard of and seen many scams in his 7 years of experience, but he had trouble understanding what Holo was talking about. What a scam! A plan where his opponent may or may not gain, but he is guaranteed to never lose. Lawrence's head swirled, white-hot. He nearly forgot to breathe. Soon the blood rose to his face. That boy will never lose. In his worst case, his profit is 0. If silver drops, all he does is return your money to you. If it rises, he gets part of whatever you make. It's a business that requires no capital. Even if no profit appears, he'll be fine. Lawrence was overwhelmed by exhaustion. To have been had by such a frivolous scheme. But it was true. He had been the one who'd sworn there was some larger ulterior motive. A traveling merchant so used to using every trick he could would naturally assume so. And so he had. Zarin had predicted a profit was almost sure to appear. Humans are pretty smart, said Holo, as though they were talking about somebody else's problem. Lawrence could only sigh. Fortunately, he hadn't yet gone out of his way to invest in trenny. All he had risked was what he had on hand. There was nothing in the contract he had with Zarin about how many he was obligated to purchase. All he could do now was pray there were no fluctuations in the marketplace. He could then point out Zaren's lie, and there'd be nothing stopping him from getting his 10 silver pieces back. Naturally, if the price dropped, he'd be able to regain them legitimately, so losing only a single piece to him felt downright inexpensive. When a merchant let his guard down, normally he lost everything. But here, all Zaren had really done was hurt Lawrence's pride. He slumped a bit before Holo, who snickered at him out of the corner of her mouth. "Although," Holo began. Lawrence looked at her beseechingly, as if to say, "There's more?" Holo looked back predatorily. "Isn't it quite common for the silver purity to drop slightly?" Suspecting that his redemption might start with this, Lawrence forced himself to straighten his leaden back. "No, normally the purity is controlled with extreme care." And yet out of nowhere there's a deal that hinges on the purity of silver coins. Can that just be chance, I wonder?" The grinning Holo seemed to be enjoying this state of affairs. No, she was definitely enjoying it. "Now, you being in that village, at that time, with that sheaf of wheat, that was chance. There was nothing so hard as discerning chance from fate. It's harder than romance for a shut-in." "That's a strange analogy," was all Lawrence could answer. "You're lost in the maze of your own thoughts. When that happens, you need a new perspective. When I'm hunting prey, sometimes I'll climb a tree. The forest looks different from on high. For example," said Holo the Wise Wolf with a crooked grin that bared her left fang, "what if the person who's planning something isn't that kid?" Oh, Lawrence felt like he'd been struck over the head. "There's no reason Zaren's profit had to come from you. For example, perhaps he was hired by somebody else, and those wages motivated him to pull you into the strange deal." Though she was fully 2 heads shorter than him, Holo seemed a giant. If you're looking at a single withered tree, it can seem like a grievous wound to the forest. But from the forest's perspective, that tree's remains will nourish other plants, acting for the good of the whole forest. If you change your perspective, a situation right in front of you can reverse itself. So, have you seen anything new?" For a moment, Lawrence suspected that Holo already knew something, but from her tone it seemed that she was not testing him, but rather was genuinely trying to help. Nothing was more important to a merchant than knowledge. But such knowledge was no mere commodity to be priced. The situation before him, his knowledge of that technique, Lawrence thought about it from a different perspective. Zaren, the only man he talked to directly. What if Zaren's gains were coming not from Lawrence, but from some other party? Lawrence's breath caught in his chest the instant he thought. If that were indeed the case, he could think of only one possible explanation. He'd heard the setup from another traveling merchant when they drank together in another town. The sheer scope of the tale was so huge he'd assumed it was yet another tavern story. Still, the story could conceivably explain why someone would do something so apparently meaningless as buying up a depreciating silver currency. He could also see why Zaren would be lying even as he signed a contract before a public servant, and would use his influence in a tavern, acting in a way that didn't make sense for a swindler. Zaren had been trying to lend the transaction as much credibility as he could in order to tempt Lawrence into buying up silver coins. If Lawrence was right, Zaren had been hired by another party to buy up silver coins. Whoever it was wanted to collect silver as discreetly as possible. The best way to collect a particular currency without attracting any attention would be to hire merchants to do it for you, appealing to their self-interest. Merchants who stood to turn a profit by buying up silver currency would not want to share information with others and would naturally be extremely careful. Then, you could just wait for an opportune moment and smoothly take over the collected currency, accomplishing your goal without influencing the marketplace or tipping anybody off. It was a common technique for buying up a commodity in advance of a higher price. The really clever part of this plan was that if the silver currency fell, the merchants would want to unload their silver in order to minimize their losses. This would make taking over their silver holdings far from difficult, and pride would keep the merchants who'd sustained losses from admitting that they'd invested in silver currency. It was a perfect plan for collecting coinage without anyone knowing. The massive scale of the plan could yield obscene profits. At least, the profits mentioned in the stories about such plans were stupendous. Lawrence chuckled in spite of himself. "You figured something out, haven't you?" said Holo. "Let's go." Where?" Lawrence had already started jogging away. He turned to Holo, impatient. "The Malone Company. That's how the plan works. The more depreciating silver currency that can be brought up, the more profit there will be. Once discovered the motivation behind someone's plan, he could profit from it. And the bigger their plan, the better.